and welcome to the CycleSmart Solutions for Cycling podcast. This episode, we are going to be talking about modes of training for cyclocross. And what I mean by that is everybody has a sense of, let's say, road training, where everybody has a sense of zone training. And zone training is, let's say, simpler or maybe easier to do in a road environment. And when it comes to other disciplines like mountain biking or cyclocross, we have the added component of thinking about how to implement zone-based training in a way that incorporates demands specific to that discipline, and potentially even includes technique incorporated into the zone training you do for that discipline. Of course, we are coaches in a coaching company that care a lot about cyclocross and have a lot of expertise in cyclocross. And we think we have a lot of things to say, unique perspectives on how to train specifically for cyclocross. And we thought this was one of the best ways that we could present that material to you. I would say the caveat that we have is we are not going to talk about zone training per se today. We already have done a testing podcast, and it would be great to go back and listen to that to understand a little bit about our approach to testing and zone training. But we are going to oversimplify zone training today for the purposes of talking about the modes or the styles or the way to do the workout. I think also this is our opportunity to note that we have Stephen Hyde joining us today, newly joined CycleSmart coach. Welcome home, Stephen, to CycleSmart, part of the CycleSmart family for a long time, and now actually formally and officially coaching for CycleSmart. So we're happy to have him join us on the call.
Hi, everybody.
Hey.
Not bad.
And so obviously who else? The other coaches that we have here today are Jacob Fetty, Jordan Villela, Mike Vandenham, Alec Donahue. I guess let's start at the bottom, huh? Let's start with, we're going to go through, we're going to use the basic 7 zones: recovery, endurance, tempo, threshold, VO2 max, anaerobic work capacity, and sprint training, ATP, CP, sprint training, neuromuscular power. Lots of different words you can use for that, but we'll use the catch-all and call it sprint training. And so let's kick it off with recovery. And it might be strange. Sometimes people don't think about the recovery zone as a training zone, but it is a very critical zone. And in our approach, we do control power outputs or workload in recovery to make sure people are doing that correctly. And so I'll throw it out there to the coaches. When you think about programming for cyclocross, I know for me, I think mostly about what I have to keep people from doing when they're supposed to be doing recovery, rather than what I want them to be doing. So if someone wants to pick up on that, like, what are your goals for recovery in a cyclocross workout? What are you hoping to achieve, or what do you want the athlete to achieve in that environment?
To ride on a flat, smooth road.
Yeah.
Not on a track, not off road.
Not at all. Not possible.
Yeah, you can't do recovery if you're riding a cross bike off road. I think the other thing that I always think about with that is when we're speaking about recovery a little bit in a workout, but also just carving out time in the week for doing some sort of recovery, and then asking yourself, is a recovery ride something that's actually the best use of my time right here? Sometimes I find in cross season, you could be doing other things that are more valuable, like prepping for the week, say doing meal planning or taking care of your bikes or doing laundry or spending time with your friends and family, as opposed to going for an hour spin on Monday, right? So it's a different equation for everybody. Sometimes people, their job is to ride bikes and they have time to go for a nice coffee ride. But for a lot of other people, it's like, what else could you be doing with this time? Is the recovery ride essential? When it comes to that being its own workout, I think, we can pivot back to what that looks like inside of a cyclocross workout though too.
Yeah, you can't stress to get it in. I have athletes that, sometimes they want to stress to get it in. And, when I put wash your bikes and get ready for the week, in the training plan, some people just like to have that checked, right? And if you have two bikes, a bunch of wheels, bunch of clothing, whatever, that's more than an hour of work, and an hour of work you probably should allocate to doing that rather than going out and spinning the legs out, taking that off your mind. And that is in itself recovering,
And,
you don't have to worry about that stuff next week.
and I would say that's universal, right? That's all season long, whatever your discipline is. That's how we're managing recovery rides sort of at any time of the year. I think what happens during the cyclocross season is people are always looking for ways to include skills or to go play on their cross bikes.
Yeah.
And I think this happens in the mountain bike season too. And they think recovery days are a day to work on skills or technique. And I don't personally. In my opinion, if you're working on skills, in order to work on skills, you almost always have to do explosive movements. You have to find a way to generate some speed. And even the movements that you're trying to practice have an aspect of explosiveness to them. Mounting, dismounting, bunny hopping.
Yeah, fast barrier work has no place in a recovery day.
Exactly.
And I've had that talk.
Right. So
I just done some peanut drills and fast barrier work, and you're like, that's not
right. So I think the other important things I think about is, so I think Al kind of hit on this. We want your recovery ride should be on the road, essentially, gravel, whatever. It shouldn't be on grass or a cyclocross track. It should be a place that you are able to ride as easily as you would like to. You shouldn't be forced to pedal hard on your recovery ride. If you're
That's where you can look
fully
at torque in a ride. So, like, instead of just power, like when you start to look at torque that starts to hit more of your fast twitch, that's what we want to get rid of on recovery days.
Yeah, right. I think the bike you use matters, and I think early in the cyclocross season, where you might still have some road events, those recovery rides are a good opportunity to make sure you're staying familiar with your road bike and going back to your road bike for those recovery rides. And that is something that you can do, I think, all cyclocross season long. You can still use your road bike for your road rides. I think for the 100% focused cyclocross riders, we're even doing the recovery rides on our cyclocross bikes, in our cyclocross position, with our mountain bike shoes and pedals, and maybe with a second set of wheels. I think if you have the means to have all of the equipment that you want at your disposal, having road wheels for your cyclocross bike, as opposed to going back to your road bike, is the ideal way to maintain your adaptation to your cyclocross bike. I think about Jeremy Powers, who liked to use his road shoes and pedals on his cyclocross bike for those road rides. Am I remembering that correctly?
If we went more than 3 hours,
We did that for a
yeah,
period
so
of time.
it was only
Yeah.
if we went long.
Yeah, I prefer people do the recovery ride on the bike that they raced on, so it's not a shock to the system. Because sometimes when they go out and they, let's say for mountain bike season, for instance, they're set up like this, and then the recovery ride they do on the road bike on the trainer, and all the muscles are cramping and firing differently, and it's not recovery, it's like
Yeah.
stress, So
Yeah.
I prefer they go on the bike that they were on
Yeah.
during the
I think-
weekend.
I think too there's a lot of kind of nuance involved in terms of like the level of fitness of the athlete, right? And I think that's probably the first thing that kind of needs to be taken into consideration when choosing what a recovery day looks like for them. Athletes with infinite depth of fitness, the more on the high end of things, can, especially within the race season, can kind of recover faster than others if other modalities are kind of going well, if they manage their time well, etc. And so sometimes like what they're looking for in recovery can be also kind of recovering their kind of mental state too, like how acute they're operating, getting their brain to function like normal again after such a heavy weekend. We go out and do 2 race days over a weekend, fly, go home, all that stuff. You're pretty smoked. those days aren't like those travel days, sitting in a car, sitting on the airplane aren't recovery.
Right.
That's not, it's never going to be recovery. Um, in some ways they're more stressful than going out for like a 2-hour ride on your body. And so it seems to me that weighing where the athlete is in their season, where how much fitness they really have, plays a very large role in whether they need to really take the time off, whether they need to go ride easy on the road, or whether there's a place for some super easy, more mental focus skills, rather than getting off road, just riding lines in a parking lot, going like riding sidewalk, even riding slightly, kind of loose stuff, where you're just connecting your brain back to the bike, can be for 10 minutes, keeping that heart rate super low, keeping the torque super low, can be super beneficial, from what I've seen.
And I think when you're at that part of the season right now too, where there's a lot of Saturday, Sunday races, when we're doing double weekends, I think this kind of hits on like how many, not just the mode of the recovery days, but how many recovery days do you need? So if I have an athlete who opened up on Friday and raced Saturday and Sunday, and maybe Sunday night is travel or even Monday is travel if they're doing the circuit, I'm giving them at least 2 recovery days after that. Sort of recovery day for each day of racing. Depends on what part of the season they're on and how important the races are. But I'm very rarely asking them to train unrecovered or not fully recovered on a Tuesday. And I think that's a mistake that a lot of athletes make, where, like we talked about, that travel's not recovery, that travel's stress. It's not training either, right? But it's stress that requires time to recover from as well. So often I have athletes who aren't doing their first workout of the week until Wednesday. And if they're racing again an important race on Saturday, Wednesday might be their only workout of the week because they've got to recover on Thursday and then travel or open up on Friday for the race that's
If
important
even,
on Saturday, right?
some of those athletes, you got to be really honest with yourself and like look in the mirror, like, am I fully recovered? And people want to rush it and they want to get that work in, and then it affects the weekend, And so it's like, for me, I would rather err on the side of more recovery, but then it's tough because you don't know how much they bring with them. If you do that Sunday race, that can last all the way up till Wednesday for some people. It's intense.
Well, I think we've kind of framed this as recovery from a race, and kind of tying in what Steven said and some of the points Mike made. Oftentimes it's more important or as important to frame recovery so you're good for the race. And that's where I find like really pulling back on people, and to some of the points Mike said, or be prepped for the weekend. And I think just go outside, walk around, get some fresh air, get some sun on your skin. And then I always have people run a filter. Like, is this going to keep me from reaching high torque? Kind of to Al's point, whatever I do today, is it going to keep me from producing a high torque or a high power when I'm asked to do that? And if the answer is yes, then you're doing something incorrect. And so I think that's really beneficial. Like, just when you go out the door, like, is this going to mess something up because, we'll get into the zones and the output later, but like a lot of cross is high output, particularly on race day. It's very binary, like very high, very low. So if you're, if you're messing up that top end, like, slow down, stop,
The language I like
That's a
for
great
that,
point.
Jacob, is to say recover from, rest for, right? So the Monday, Tuesday is recovery from. And of course, you're also recovering from training, but the recovery that happens later in the week, the recovery rides that happen later in the week, is a little bit of resting for what's coming up on the weekend. So yeah, I agree completely. And it's kind of the way I like to phrase that. So people understand, we call them recovery rides, but some of them are rest for something, like you were saying.
Yeah,
Yeah.
100%.
Let's
So often the conversation, in the beginning of the week has to come from cues over the weekend too. If we're talking about the scenario of racing, quite often you have athletes that say, get done with the race week and say, man, I really couldn't go as hard as I felt like I could. And often that's a product of not being recovered enough. And then they come out of the other side of the weekend and say, I should train harder because I wasn't able to reach the depth I wanted to reach. And
Endless
it's this
cycle,
like
man.
vicious
It's the endless
cycle
cycle.
Right.
of
Right.
never
Yeah.
recovering.
Right.
The classic, I wasn't snappy, so I should train more.
Right.
Yeah.
Instead of recognizing what they needed to be was fresher, so that they had access to that maximum torque and power that they wanted to make. Absolutely. I mean, we probably all made that mistake early in our careers, but that's why we're here now, to keep you from making those, right? That's a great
And
point.
shoot, I still make that mistake. That's why I have a coach.
Well, and again, it's the time of the time of the year it is matters, and the type of event that you're training for matters. But yeah, you can't be tired for cross and expect a good performance, right? You can't access your fitness in the way that you need to if you're tired, and that really makes a big difference for cross. And obviously some of this carries over to endurance, so let's move and talk about that next zone and your goals when you're doing endurance training, and how that sort of differs from recovery. And we talked in the testing podcast about what our goals are with endurance training and power output that you're trying to hold on to. And what I want to put out to the coaches here is to ask you, like, there are a lot of different ways to do endurance training during the cross season, and a lot of different reasons to do it. What are some of those things for each of you? When do you do it? Why do you do it? How do you do it? That's different from road season.
I think the biggest challenge is finding time to do endurance in the cross season. It's pretty easy to race once, sometimes even twice every single weekend all season long. And when you see athletes where the bottom kind of falls out in late October, early November, it is often that they were racing all the time and they neglected to do any type of zone 2 work. So when I'm building a schedule with my athletes, it's sometimes about finding weekends where you don't have to race, where they aren't target events, and you'd be better served by doing a 3-hour zone 2 ride. Something that we alluded to earlier was, well, Tuesdays, is that a recovery day? And for most athletes it is. Sometimes for very fit athletes with very high capacity, you can do some zone 2, but that's why there's no stock week for cyclocross racing, right? What you give someone who can train 800 hours a year is very different than what someone who's training 400 hours a year is doing because of their capacity.
I think what you're...
Yeah, and that has to be... Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I think what that triggers to me, Mike, is thinking about trying to get a lot of that endurance training done early in the season. And by early in the season, I mean that might be July, August. And then once the racing season starts, if you're still trying to build foundation in September, October, the time change for a lot of our athletes is the cutoff. It's very hard to do volume, not just talking about endurance paced rides, but volume, training volume goes down for so many of our athletes once the time changes. They're light limited, they're weather limited.
Yeah, I'll look at double sessions. So like getting an hour of like really low variability zone 2 in the morning, or even like time after your race, like start like finding smaller doses of it. But with zone 2, I'm not looking for high variability at any point. So when you go out and like these like fun like exploration rides, like they're fun. You might work on some skills, but they're not really zone 2 because they are making it hard to. Yeah, they're killing your kind of variability in your torque production. But I think that's where there's a lot of utility in split days, where even just like get up early and do like an hour, even on like rollers or the trainer in the morning. That's a really good way to kind of pad some zone 2 for very busy people. And then definitely like, double races are not.
Yeah, I find it.
There's almost no utility to double races. Like Sunday go long or ride after your race.
There you go.
Both days. Yeah.
I wanted to make sure we talked about that. And so let me seize on that for you, Al. Because that's the second part of what Mike also said. I love that when there's a Saturday race and no race on Sunday, or athletes are skipping that Sunday race, doing that endurance ride on Sunday after a Saturday race is often like one of the most effective places, I think, to get that in. I agree, and also often talk with the athletes about, can you add time to your race day? If you've driven out someplace and you've dedicated the day to racing, and there's some daylight left after your race, can you go out for an hour on the road to add that zone 2 to that day if you've already, especially if that's Sunday. For athletes who have time, sometimes a Monday endurance day can work for people depending on their schedule. If they've had a Sunday race and they want to add some zone 2, and then that turns into a Tuesday recovery day, lots of different ways to solve that. But you both hit on that, and I think that's sneaking in the zone 2, right?
If your race is later in the day, the hour before your, like the morning spin on the rollers, or like the hour before, that's also a great way to pad out some time. It might not be quite zone 2. It might be kind of very low or like high zone 1. But it's still just good volume and kind of like keeping that kind of like efficiency of pedal stroke up there.
It's also a great day, especially for athletes, like for all athletes, but especially for athletes that get really nervous about races. That morning leading up to the race can be pretty daunting, and doing something else can be very valuable as well. So going and doing an hour where you're riding with your friends and going to a coffee shop might actually be a way better use of your time than sort of sitting there worrying about your 3 o'clock race start.
Let me ask all of you this.
I'm making a hard push for rollers coming back. Do an hour of zone 2 on rollers.
Thank you.
You see a lot of people using them for warm-up now too. I feel like, they are. They're coming back generally. I don't know if, can we thank the mountain bike gang for reintroducing rollers? Get to keep your wheels on for the warm-up. But what I wanted to ask you guys is, what about total time? Like, let's talk about volume. When we're doing zone 2 during cyclocross season, a question I think we get a lot is, how long should my endurance rides be? What do I need for cyclocross? And of course, the answer is it depends, right? But what do you guys like for different athletes as targets for? Yeah.
Well, I think it's a really difficult thing to kind of manage in an individual athlete, because they're, especially within the season, if you have these kind of like micro builds, areas where you can add a little bit of volume, and the expectation is that maybe some of the snap comes down during the races. The cues and conversation around how hard one should go, right? Like, what's the feeling? How calibrated are they to zone 2? Knowing where it's really appropriate to like ride by feel, so that ride by heart rate, ride by feel, going off of like how difficult the weekend was on them, how hard their recovery needs to be, and kind of using that endurance day, as like some recovery, some endurance without tanking yourself for the weekend. It's super easy to tank your next weekend on a Tuesday by heading out and doing a 2-hour ride that should be totally manageable and making it really hard.
Well, I think it depends
not
how
recovering for Wednesday, etc.
Yeah, how mature the athlete is. Like I've even had this, myself, I was working with Jacob, and he was telling me, that you'd be surprised how easy you need to ride. Real easy ride should be really easy, and like it's hard to go out there and you're doing rolling hills and stuff like that, and some of the athletes just don't have they're just not ready for that yet. Sometimes you have to like really lay it down easy. So I try to keep mine to most of my athletes to an hour and a half, depending on what we can frame them in with.
I think a lot of it depends on if people actually do zone 2.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There is such a wide definition of zone 2. And I mean, for some people, man, if they get like 15 minutes of like solid zone 2 in, I'm pretty pumped. So, and then I think kind of just going back to what you're saying, Mike, though, like, I think you're kind of coming at what you said about race day and that morning spin from the elite athlete, national champion that you are. I think for some people, though, that makes the day way too long. The people that are doing like 5 to 8 hours a week and still need to do course prep and course recon, all of a sudden, like the race day is their biggest volume of the week, and I know that's not what you mean, but I thought it was important that we put a little caveat in there. Like, hey, like if you're training 5 hours a week, you might not make race day your 4 hours of that 5 hours. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but
Yeah,
you kind of get the
it turns
point.
into a training day
So
that's bigger than the other. Yeah,
yeah,
that's right. That's right. I think that's
yeah,
one of the challenges with warming up for cyclocross, which is a whole other podcast. But we have these warm up requirements for cross where we, at least from CycleSmart perspective, like we really emphasize riding the course and inspecting the course, and the warm up that you might do that is perfect for like physiological purposes is not perfectly aligned with the warm up that you need to do to be prepared for a cyclocross race course. And so I often think the endurance rides you need to be able to complete in training have to prepare you for the amount of riding that you sometimes have to do on race day just to be able to inspect the course properly. Not just warm up, but do course inspection. So, and those things don't always line up. You don't always have the time to do what you would like to do, just like like Jacob was saying. So, do we really answer the? Oh, actually, before I go into that, let's pause for a second. We have to let Stephen go here at this point. Stephen, thanks for joining us for the window that you had.
Yep, my pleasure.
We'll talk to you on the next
Sorry.
podcast. Yep.
Sorry I couldn't stay longer. All right. Have fun, everybody.
Yeah.
The answer about how long those endurance rides should be absolutely is it depends, because we know that 2 hours of zone 2 is an endurance ride for some people and 6 hours of zone 2 is an endurance ride for others. And, it just depends
Not
on
during cross,
what you're
not
trying
during
to
cross
do.
season.
Right. So I'm just giving the
Three and a
range
half
of what people do.
Three and a half
and
is the upper limit for cross season. Like we're not doing cross really if we're going above 3.5. And I usually use a rule of thumb, like 1.5 to 2 times your weekly daily ride average. You can do time wise or kilojoule wise, but don't exceed double what you're doing on a kind of average day.
Yeah, I
But yeah,
certainly.
I think that
I didn't mean to suggest that someone should go for a 6 hour ride in the middle of the cross season. I think I like that 3 hour mark. I think is a magic sweet spot that even a time crunched athlete can often make time for on a Sunday or a weekend day, and is often within their physical capabilities, even if it's a little bit of a reach, but also a sufficient amount of training for someone who's racing at a professional level.
and then it seems like
I
after
just
that
sort
three
of
and a
want to
half
highlight again. Oh, I just want to highlight again when we're talking about this that so much of the zone 2 stuff is about scheduling with your coach, right? You can't have A races 2 times every single weekend. It comes down to sitting down and making a schedule and setting up your goals so that you can fit in a 3 hour ride on a Sunday, right?
Yeah. Before we move on to tempo, Jacob, did you have one more thing you wanted to add there? I don't know if you were getting cut off there. Okay.
no, I'm good.
So tempo, we talk about zone 3 or tempo work, I think is interesting during the cross season. God, for lots of reasons. And I feel like I could talk on my own for a while about it, and I want to take a step back and let all of you talk about it. But how are you using tempo in the cross season, if you're using it at all? Maybe you're not even doing. Maybe your athletes aren't even doing tempo. And so if they aren't doing it, why aren't they doing it? If they are doing it, why are they doing it, and how are they doing it? Who wants to run with that?
Sure. Yeah, I would say most of the time my athletes are not doing tempo in the cross season in like the sense that they're pedaling at tempo, but we may spend time in tempo heart rate zones riding off road. So those are two very different things. Not strictly tempo as you might understand it, doing a
Steady state 30
3
minute
by
block.
30-minute steady state blocks,
Yeah.
but I might tell someone do your race pace minus 15 beats per minute, so essentially a tempo heart rate zone, and do that on your cross course because we don't want to blow you out for the weekend, but we still need to get a little bit sharp and a little bit of skills work in.
Yeah.
Yeah, I echo that. I mean, we do the practices over here. It's around the same thing, following each other, leading, so you can, retain that info of steering and, getting off the bike the right way and without like completely blowing yourself out and, just surviving. So that's the tempo that I like, that's more almost like holistically
Yeah.
happening with everything, all the different parameters of the zones.
I obviously I like it for warm up. I like tempo, and I literally like every workout for me, and every workout that I assign has some small amount of tempo as part of the warm up routine before the intervals. Not every athlete has time to include that, but I love the tempo as a place to check in with yourself before you start the hard work of the day. You might ride out at an endurance pace to the place that you're going to do your spot, and be a little unsure about how you're feeling, and a 5 to 15 minute block of tempo where you're just really getting a sense of how you feel can be the place that you check in and be like, nope, I got to go home. I feel terrible doing tempo, or like, hey, I feel good. Everything's here. I'm ready to do the workout. So not enough to ruin the workout, just enough to check in with yourself. I think I think from a skills or training standpoint, where I like tempo is for a little bit of driving at speed without the explosiveness. Like I often describe to people, the difference between tempo and threshold when you're riding on a cross course is essentially the difference between sprinting out of the turns or not. If you are on a cross course and just making a corner and going back to the pace that you were riding without the reacceleration, that's where you see that shows up most in your heart rate response. That's how you can observe that, since you aren't really observing the power. And so that heart rate, that 10 to 15 beat difference heart rate that you're talking about, Mike, from race pace to tempo, I think that shows up in the removing the accelerations from the riding. So I'll use it as a third training day often, where we have time to do another training day and we want to do some driving on a track as opposed to a road, like an endurance ride on the road. And so 20 or 30-minute blocks on a track without the speed changes gets a little, that's where we do like the flow training that we talk about, how to get that efficiency and flow on a course, but without doing that torquey, big explosive speed changes. That's where I like to use it.
Yeah, you could
Well,
concentrate on
I
less
think one of the
braking,
things though, like
more.
to one of the really beneficial things of riding a cross course at tempo is there's not a big speed difference between riding threshold and riding tempo on most courses if you kind of help your athlete set up the appropriate course. So you're getting, I think as we escalate through these zones, you're going to see more of a Venn diagram of like active skill development versus passive, and then how to like still develop those skills. And riding at almost race pace, and sometimes if you're even having some descents and you can be disciplined with how you set up for those descents, meaning you don't do a bunch of climbing, you're getting the skill set acquisition of basically race pace without the investment of going that hard. And I think that's super, super, maybe even more important than just saying, okay, well, I'm riding tempo. It's like, no, I'm driving my bike and working on my skills at race pace. And sometimes if you're staying fresher because you're doing tempo, you actually can descend harder. You have better vision. You're more locked in. You refer to it as flow state, trying to get into that groove. But then you're even down a layer too, like to really see things better, set up better. You're not over driving. So I think that's where tempo is like very useful in cyclocross, more useful for the skill set than it is like the physiological aspect of it.
Yeah, I think you discover sometimes doing tempo on a track that the speed limit is not that different than when you're doing threshold. And we'll kind of move right into threshold with that as our lead in. But, if you're sprinting out of the turn and braking hard for the next turn, the speed limit through that turn is the same. And you might reach that speed limit doing tempo. And so you get the driving benefit, the skills practice just at tempo pace, enough to be beneficial. Yeah, let's take that into threshold, and like kind of like the difference between when we're doing threshold and when we're doing tempo is a good starting point. But I think we're all using differing amounts of threshold in our training recommendations for the athletes, but it feels fair to say that we do a lot of threshold work in the cross season, because we're Yeah, most resembles what we're doing on the weekend. And it's where probably most of the skills acquisition comes from because you're moving at speeds relative to what you're doing on the weekend. But let me put it
So
out to you guys. Yeah, Mike.
I would agree and disagree with that simultaneously.
Yeah, good.
I do a lot of threshold heart rate based work, but especially when we get into the season and for a lot of my cross races in general, not that much steady state threshold.
Yeah, let me.
Very, very, very little.
Yeah, let me interrupt you there for a second because I think it's important. I think I hadn't said this yet, and none of us have said it yet, and we should say it here. We are mostly determining these intensities when we're training for cross based on heart rate and not based on power. And I should have made that point at the outset. And this is why this is important. Yes, we are recording power when we're doing these cross workouts. We want to know what the power is, but we aren't looking at it while we're doing cross workouts, especially if we're doing cross workouts on a track. We care about perceived exertion and heart rate response, but you can't pace any of these intervals by power when you're riding on a track. And that's where most of this work is happening. If you're doing steady state work on the road, or if you're doing variable power work on the road, you may then be paying attention to power and pacing by power. But we really are paying attention to perceived exertion and heart rate here. Now, when is that power going to be useful? It's useful if you do your workouts on the same track each week and you're able to develop a relationship between when I ride at threshold heart rate on this particular track in these particular conditions, I usually make about this much power. And this week I made more power, or this week I made less power. So you can compare intensity on a track that you ride each week. But on the weekends, if you have power on the bike that you race on, courses are different. Some have more running than others. You might get a torquey course. It could rain. Like the power isn't telling you much when you're on different tracks all the time. So that's probably an important point to have made at the outset, because I think a lot of athletes do make that mistake who have power meters for cross, think that they're going to do their cross work based on power. We're only looking at that power when we're done. And even then we're saying, this didn't tell us much. How'd you feel? What was your heart rate?
And sometimes, yeah, that how did you feel, I think, is such a big thing, because sometimes the average power numbers from a cross lap or a cross course can really bury the lead a little bit there. You can do good average power and have no snap and not be able to accelerate out of the corners and be plugging away, and you can do the same power numbers and feel sharp and snappy and good. And those are different things. Like you need to tell, if we're coaching you, us, about how that workout actually felt, not just dig through the average power numbers, right? Because it makes a difference. But some of the types, I guess, if we're defining it that way, some of the types of threshold work that we do during the cross season would be those off-road workouts. If you want to define variable power threshold as threshold, so a Tabata, like a 30-30 or a 40-20, that's a pretty common one.
I like to define, that is, I like that terminology, variable power threshold, yeah.
Or motor pacing, which is a luxury that most people don't have, but that can be a very, very useful type of workout as well, as long as, and Al has drilled this into me, Al's been my coach for 8 years, Al's drilled this into me, as long as you do that correctly. And I'd love him to fill in, like, what does a good motor pacing session look like for cross versus a terrible one?
With that, I think, we don't want to be on the gas consistently. Like, kind of once you like cook your legs and like you're on your high torque fibers just to make the power to follow the scooter, and there's never an on off, and they're like, we lose that variability. That's like when you're really detraining exactly what we're seeking to sharpen. So there's a lot of perceived exertion, and that one, it doesn't necessarily show up in a file, but the athlete, if they're kind of well drilled, they know that like they've sat on their kind of their most important fibers in a way that makes them unable to race well. That one takes, I think, a lot of coaching there, because it's like it will depend on like how deeply you get into like an elevated lactate, and are you recovering well above threshold?
And
I think that
the
there's a
benefit
lot
there,
of
Al.
so there's a lot of place for e-bike motor pacing too. So I think that's something that could really change motor pacing. Like get a buddy with an e-bike, and especially the speeds for cross on a flat road don't need to, for the majority of people, don't need to be beyond what a decent e-bike could do. So you could both go on a ride and get fantastic motor pacing.
And the benefit there, Al, that you're looking for when you're motor pacing for cross is that stochastic, random, on-off power application that you get from trying to draft the scooter. Right? That's what you're after there. Yeah.
Yes. And usually we want to ramp up, if we start really hard and just you cook yourself in the first few minutes and just stay underwater the whole time, you're just barely hang on. That doesn't tend to be great. We kind of easing into the session and finishing very hard and very sharp. And any a rolling course is really good because there's a lot more variation. And as the driver, you should really be punching it over the top, because then the athlete knows that if they just go all in over the top, there's a break on the other side. But you'll see that the people that don't do that, and there's oh, I'll just grind back on in the descent. You're we're just doing it wrong at that point. So the terrain is big in motor pacing, where you want the big on and off. And
Yeah, Mike, you take it from there while Al's connection comes back.
Yeah, and I was just going to say there that a lot of most of the athletes I coach don't have access to us.
Sorry, Al, we lost you for a second there.
We're losing now. I was saying, yeah, most of the athletes we have don't have access to a scooter, of course. That's kind of like an elite. You need someone to drive it. You need the time to do it. You need to do it in the middle of the day.
The skill ability to do it. Yeah.
However, all those things that we just hit on right there can actually apply to your threshold work. I really like people, especially when they're in the middle of the season, aren't sure how they're feeling, to ramp into these workouts a little bit. If you're doing a threshold workout off-road, or you're doing Tabatas 40/20s on-road, we don't need to bury you in the first set, right?
Yeah.
How do you feel? Okay, that one was pretty good. Maybe we go up a little bit. Okay, that one was pretty good. Maybe we go up a little bit. Or, yeah, you felt you can get through that workout, but you didn't feel great. Maybe that's just what we're at today, right? We don't want to bury you and have no snap for if you have 3 intervals, for intervals 2 and 3.
For our Wednesday group training session, where as opposed to having a Wednesday training race, our workout is a group workout of people of all different ability levels, and it's the standard 2x20 threshold workout. So we do 2 20-minute races with 10 minutes of recovery in between. I've removed that. We don't refer to them as races. We refer to them as intervals now. And I've removed a formal start from the beginning of the interval, because even though we want to practice starts, if we include a formal start at the beginning of that 20-minute interval, it turns into a race. People sprint off the line. They spike the first 5 minutes of that interval and put themselves in the position that Al was talking about with motor pacing that we want to avoid. So if we just roll into the interval together, even though some people will eventually be overpacing that interval because everybody's chasing someone stronger than them, at least we can control the overpacing of the first 5 minutes so that it's sustainable and repeatable for most of those athletes. And that's
something.
Yeah.
The motor pacing
something
also
that
is
I
good.
learned.
Sorry.
Well, yeah, we'll come back to that. Something I learned training in Europe with some of the Euro guys actually is I was riding with Lawrence and Dieter Sweek, who are brothers and very fast but different speeds, and they would do these efforts together in their midweek workout. But Dieter, who is a little bit slower than Lawrence, wouldn't kill himself. He would just let himself get dropped, take a shortcut, join right back onto the wheel, as opposed to just smashing himself to try to keep up with his slightly faster and more fit brother. And that was kind of revelatory. It's oh, you don't need these midweek workouts to be a race every single time. Be smart with it.
Right.
And I think that's kind of what you're saying too, and that's coming right from the best riders in the world.
Yeah. I think if we're going to sum up the threshold, the thing that I like the amount of threshold work an athlete can finish during the week to match what they have to do in the races on the weekend. So if we think about the categories as A, B, and C, and C races are 30 minutes and B races are 45 minutes and A races are 60 minutes, I want an athlete to be able to build up to being able to complete that amount of threshold work in training as part of their preparation for the season, what they do to maintain their fitness during the season might be reduced from that because they're getting, racing is training for them as well, and we want to recover from it. But, and I have people doing that in 15 or 20-minute blocks. I know we don't all rely
that
on,
ties in really
yeah.
well with like threshold is something that expands capacity. It doesn't necessarily bring your threshold up, but we use threshold as something that enhances your capacity to do work at a given level and resist fatigue.
Yeah, great point.
Yeah, so I think
Yeah,
that's
great point.
that's one of the best uses of the threshold zone is to where you're at, you can increase time to exhaustion.
Yep. Yeah.
And
Yeah,
then going
great
back to
point.
the motor pacing thing, actually, I like tempo motor pacing a lot. If people are a little tired, getting on something flat and just getting really high leg speed, and like you get these little bursts that like you just feel better by the end of the moto session. Every moto session doesn't need to kill you. Like if you finish a workout and you feel better and you want more at the end, that's often fantastic for a mid-season cross workout.
Yeah, great. It's funny, we spent a surprising amount of time talking about motor pacing, and like you said, Mike, it's not something that's accessible or available for everything, but I think it is important to talk about because people do ask. And also, I love Al's point about e-bike motor pacing becoming the way motor pacing will become more accessible to people. Like just having someone who you can draft, who can generate the speed and power to force you to ride at that higher intensity, or allow you to ride at that higher intensity while still being on a wheel, while still drafting, right? So
yeah. Moto work's good to discuss because it's the ideal we're trying to emulate with solo training. And that's kind of like solo training often goes to like that steady state mode. And so we're looking at what's the ideal and how can we most like accurately emulate that without a moto.
Yeah. So before we move on to VO2, let's make this the last point on threshold. And Al, you just triggered that for me. When we're looking at power and heart rate files of time trials and criteriums and cyclocross, we learned this 20 years ago, right? When we first got power meters, and then not everybody was racing with power meters, but we started racing with power meters, and then we started racing cross with power meters. Racing cross with a power meter was revelatory because it confirmed for us visually a thing that we essentially already knew, and that most of the time cyclocross is not a time trial. It is not a steady state effort. You will see the same heart rate response. It will be let's say a steady state heart rate response. You will be pinned from start to finish based on heart rate, but the power application will be variable, and variable different from a criterium in the sense that if we want to simplify or oversimplify criteriums as 15 seconds on and 15 seconds off as the pattern of a criterium, a hard criterium, cyclocross maybe more resembles 40 seconds on and 20 seconds off, longer periods on at a slightly lower power than a criterium, but still often over threshold for the periods that are on, and then periods of recovery. It's hard to call it recovery, periods of not pedaling or low power pedaling through transitions, followed by a sharp acceleration and then settling back down at a pace at or around threshold. So when we collect power data for cross, you can visually see that. And so that's why Al, for the listeners, when Al is talking about motor pacing to achieve that variable power in training, that's why we're trying to achieve that variable power, because cyclocross isn't a steady state effort, even if there's a steady heart rate response to it. It's a variable power effort. Anything to add to threshold before we move on to VO2? For VO2 work, again, when we're trying to contextualize these zones for athletes, since we're not pacing by power, I've already described the difference between threshold and tempo as the difference between sprinting out of turns or not, as one thing to seize on. I often describe VO2 interval pace as lap one pacing. It's over. It's not sustainable. You can't do it for the full 30 or 45 or 60 minutes. It's over what you can do. And those intervals are in the range that we usually do VO2 work at. It could be as short as 3 minutes or as long as 8 minutes, but we're generally doing 4 to 5 minute efforts in VO2. But I like those VO2 workouts to be on a track if we're still trying to work on technique and trying to resemble that first lap pace where you're not just sprinting out of the turns, you're going as hard as you can from turn to turn or from transition to transition. You're sprinting out of the turn and staying on the gas until the next interruption in a way that's not sustainable. I think that's my general simple description. Thoughts on that or things to add to that? How are you all using VO2 work during the season?
I would also say that.
Go ahead, Mike.
I was just going to say, I would say that occasionally VO2 is one of the things that I like to my athletes to touch on the road at a little bit of a steady state, but shorter, maybe shorter than they were doing leading up to the season. 3 minutes, maybe 4 minutes, maybe if you want to call some of those Tabatas like that, you are pedaling in the VO2 zone. Oftentimes, not even though it resembles threshold heart rate. So for sure, but that can actually, VO2 can also be an area like where you want to touch up at points in the season on the road bike or your cross bike with road tires.
Yeah, I like to start with a lot of VO2, similar to mountain bike season, trying to build up, that engine and then take it out into different kind of forms with because each of them have a different spiciness to them, whether you want to aim for that lower end of the VO2 where it's almost high threshold, or you want to get into that like 40-20 kind of feel where it's like butting up against a really tough effort.
And to make a plug for something that we do right here, what I do for VO2 with different athletes depends a lot on the type of athlete they are, and if I have an inside test, what that inside test is telling me that they need to do. Right? For an athlete that has a really high VLA, we might be doing a totally different VO2 workout than for someone that has a really low one.
Also, what about how does where they live or the kind of tracks do you think they're going to be racing on factor into things? Like, do you change that if they're, let's say it's early this season and you're expecting a lot of dry, fast, grass criterium type races, or it's later in the season, or they live in a place where it's often muddier and you're expecting a lot of sort of slower, high torque, deep mud races, maybe with a lot of running, or even the difference between doing like the USCX series and then going to Europe after that and racing those kinds of tracks. Does how you do that change based on where the athlete races as well as their physiology?
Well, I want to take one step back before you get too granular with that. And for me, with VO2 max, and then I guess we'll get to the more anaerobic stuff after this, there's two things that I think people that race off-road always mess up, and it's pacing and it's the ability to go hard. Most people, when it starts to get hard, they're out. And you can take that all the way back to the beginning of this conversation with the easy rides and creating the aerobic depth through the VO2 rides. So like early season, I like to see more of the VO2 stuff be steady state, starting at like 3 minutes and then expanding, because that really teaches them, hey man, if you get in over your head, you're not going to finish this effort. And some of the things that Mike brought up in the previous thing about with his Tabata is like not overpacing the first set that you're doing. So like all of that, like just the mentality of approach is huge. And I think in the circumstances are pretty severe too. You can overpace a tempo workout and still pull off the next one. If you overpace your VO2, your whole workout's kaput.
Great
so
point.
It's very, very, very helpful in getting people in tune with the not just perceived exertion, but their perception of their perceived exertion. That really happens with VO2. And then also like just getting people to understand that if you're going to be an off-road athlete, you have to learn how to suffer. You have to learn how to like figure out the last minute or the last 30 seconds or the last whatever of your last set. And most people have a hard time doing that. And that's where I find that power meters, steady state on the road early season are very beneficial because it sets that tone. And then we can go off road with more specific integration of skills, 40, 20s, 30, 30s on the cross course, whatever. Because now they have that framework better established.
Yeah. I think my athletes who are road, if you're racing road during the summer and cross in the fall, they're getting exactly what you're talking about there in that road season work that they do. They they have a sense of the pacing from doing it in a steady state way during the road. But if you're just an off-road athlete, you've got to make a point, like you're saying, of going back to doing it on the road in a steady state way. Yeah, it's a good point.
Okay, steady
I
state
think
makes up about
completing
80,
these workouts is
80% of the work I'm doing with this, and it's beginning of the season, maybe a little bit of a break during the middle, but then we hit it again. Like steady state VO2 is non-negotiable in the vast majority of critical work people do in the season.
And so
It's
you're sending
something
them back to the road, Al, for that, rather than
100%.
having them
Yes.
doing it on a track?
Yes.
Mhm.
The track maybe makes up
Great.
10 to like, it's not really productive and a lot, like doing a lot of it because we're doing a lot of it in races, and it's not, you can overpace and kind of get a little bit of work, but like your brain doesn't work and you're not really learning new skills at zone 5.
Let me ask you this, and not as a contradiction, but as a curious question. Do you think it's more or less beneficial based on your ability level? So if you're a newer rider, can you benefit more from doing the VO2 work on a track than a more advanced rider would who has a more developed skill set?
Most of my new
And so
riders still can't pace laps effectively enough. So like A, the development you get from VO2, and B, like the pacing is more important than anything, and that even like the fatigue resistance to multiple bouts of VO2. And I just see like I want to like really, really reinforce skill acquisition at tempo to threshold, because that's where you learn more. Your brain stops learning at VO2 because you can't really juggle that kind of oxygen deficit and fine motor skill very well. So I'd say like it really slows down acquisition once like you can't think. You're just reactive. You're a single cell organism just bouncing off things.
Do you think you're 100% right about that, and I think we all know that feeling. Do you think there's a benefit to reproducing that in training, and so that you aren't just experiencing that in the races? And so I guess
10 to 20% of your VO2 time, but I'd say 80% like just get better at making power above threshold. And there's so much like analytical work that comes out of that, where I can use VO2 workouts as tests. There's like so much you just get out of that workout, and so I'd say 80% of the time I'm doing steady state on the road on your cross bike.
Yeah, you're right. You're not saying that you're not doing that at all. I think I sometimes with new athletes, with less skilled cross athletes, I will sometimes say, hey, your driving needs so much improvement. Your cross skills need so much improvement, and you're pretty fit from the road season, that we are going to sacrifice some power production and potentially some fitness to really do all of your work in the field, because you need a lot of work here in the field. And we need to work on teaching you how to go faster with the fitness you have as a bigger priority over increasing fitness, if that's a sliding scale at all. So I hope that's not, and I don't think it's contradictory to what you're saying. I think it's sometimes I'll really go extreme in that way to prioritize cross skills over fitness.
This is where I want to get e-cross bikes so people can go really fast with tempo output. And so you're just overdriving.
Do you remember when you were coaching? I think you were coaching Jeremy at the time, but do you remember when, I feel like we got this info from Jeremy, but Jeremy was opening up at a Euro race on the track the day before, and Stibar was motor pacing on the track. He had a scooter meeting him at exits of technical sections where he was getting on the scooter for the paved sections between the technical sections. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
It's so wild to have that amount of foresight or thought to truly try to recreate race conditions and have the help to do it, but also just the logistics of pulling that off. Like,
that's also a depth of fitness thing. Stibar's riding 1,000 hours a year and can pull this off.
That guy used to come to races.
To.
He had 3 different offset forks for his specialized crux. 3 different ones, and he would change them per race per how he wanted to ride.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah,
Let's not get too off track, but I remember hearing that and thinking like, okay, that's pretty next level. Like I need my scooter driver to meet me at the course to help me with my openers, you know? Not a thing that we're recommending to clients ourselves. Um,
I guess if I could touch on the VO2
yeah.
idea once, um, what I find is a lot of my athletes, when they pace VO2 in the field, like, on a course, the variability is so high, the normalized power, whatever you want to call it, doesn't end up in VO2. And I like that boring out of the engine where you could just keep them at one specific pace the entire time. And I find that to be the most beneficial, that they could reproduce that.
But
And
I
then
think the thing
later on, coming in with the,
I think we've all touched on this briefly is that there are different times of the year where we do different things, right?
Yeah.
Before the season, maybe some steady state VO2 work, and then maybe some specificity, and then you're in racing lots, and maybe you can't do steady state work, but then maybe there's a few weeks off before nationals, and you're back to doing some steady state work. Like
And something I've
there's
switched to right now
there's just
is
different times.
there's front loaded VO2 where you start with a hard effort and like see how people handle a front loaded VO2 effort to see how their system is reacting to, something like a start. Can they start hard and get back to reasonable VO2? And that one is very informative. You'll find people that do that and can't pedal their way out of a wet paper bag after a hard start. So you know that their body doesn't
Well,
handle above threshold well.
you see this in the races where you see riders who are fast starters. I unfortunately know this from experience. Riders who are fast starters end up in a group of riders they can't ride with and completely detonate. And it takes a long time to learn how to hold back at the start if you're a good starter so that you don't overpace the start. Because it's not free. Just because you can do it doesn't mean you don't pay for it. And that's a lesson that we have to teach people. But you end up in the third group instead of the second group because you tried to ride with the first group because you're a good starter.
And
I think the way I would summarize
so
this
I'll
is,
also modulate, like,
yeah,
sometimes
sorry,
I'll
go
do a
ahead.
VO2 with a big glycolytic effort at the end, because that's another check. Be like, is this really like kind of, 7 to 10% over threshold? Because if it is, then they can still reproduce that large glycolytic effort at the end. It's a very
Mm-hmm.
different amount of stress on the system, but I think how you play the glycolytic effort and like how you're kind of titrating the glycolysis into the effort is very important, and has very different
And
impact from rider to rider.
would for what that speaks to me is the difference also between doing VO2 work for criterium season and doing VO2 work for cross season, where we start with the sprint rather than finishing with the sprint. And so just in terms of how that feels to a person, you want them to be accustomed to, unfortunately, like over starting and having to come back to threshold. Whereas in crit season, if we're just using crits as an example, we need to raise up to that. It gets harder in the last 5 minutes, and you're supposed to be finishing ideally with your peak powers at the end. And in cross, we're starting with peak powers and going down, and hopefully being able to do it again later. I think the thing that I want to pull out from everything that you've all said is, um, as the intensity of the work that we're doing is going up, the ability to do it on a track is going down in terms of the effectiveness of the work in the zone because you are limited by the track. And at the same time, that is the thing that we want to get better at. Not just going faster on a track, but finding the places that we can pedal on a track and pedaling hard in those places in a way that doesn't ruin our efficiency or our economy on that track. So some of that is better done at tempo. Some of that is done well at threshold. It becomes very limited at VO2 because you're speed limited, and you'll be, whether you're more or less speed limited based on your skill level versus your fitness level, really, there's not a straight answer to that. A fitness limited athlete may also be skill limited. Their speed limit in a corner is probably also related to their fitness level. But we've all seen many times the very fit road pro come over to cyclocross and be incredibly skill limited and destroy sections between transitions and then be completely in the way and slow down in the corner so that a more skilled and less fit or less strong athlete is able to ride with that athlete. I think about when Chris Horner was doing cyclocross, how I always ended up riding with Chris Horner in the races because of a huge difference in our power production ability and a huge difference in our skills put us pretty close to each other in the races, which was slightly annoying for me, I suppose, but um, that's a whole other podcast. All right, let's take that into AWC work. How much time do we have left for you, Jacob, and Mike?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Let's try and see if we can do the AWC anaerobic work capacity part while we still have you, and then we'll do the sprints after we let you guys go. With anaerobic work capacity intervals, my traditional standard road, cross, whatever part of the year is, I really like 1 minute intervals for this. And the range I think that we use is sort of 30 seconds to 2 minutes. And I know you all might have different preferences, so I really want to hear them. I think there's lots of different ways to approach this. I tend to use this for start practice mostly, where I have an athlete do 1 minute all out efforts, usually on the road, maybe on a slight uphill, but not usually on a climb. And they're just practicing cross starts, coming to a complete start, picking your gear, standing, starting your timer so that it's running, hitting the lap button, sprinting as hard as you can, and then riding as hard as you can for a minute, and then taking 10 minutes of recovery between each one, and doing 4 to 6 of those, or 2 to 6 of those, depending on the athlete's ability. And that's not that different from the road season, with the exception of coming to a complete stop and reproducing the actual start mechanism. Other ways that sometimes we can do this, you can do sand passages where you soft pedal into deep sand and then pedal as hard as you can for a minute to try to pedal out of the sand is one way to do it. But what are you all doing for both duration of anaerobic work capacity efforts and mode? How are you doing them? Are you doing start practices or are you doing something else?
Yes. Yeah, so my preferred, my favorite is a 30-second effort. Personally, I've seen people have some success with it, but yeah, sometimes we'll mix that up. I like to mix it up a lot between doing a standing start. Sometimes even, we often do these on pavement, but having people do safely, having people do a U-turn, so it's like they're accelerating out of a corner and then jumping into the effort, so they're not unclipped, but they're operating from a very, very slow speed. And then sometimes doing them from a high speed. So if we did if we did multiple sets, say we did 3 sets, I might have you do 1 of each of those. If we're doing 6, you might do a couple of each, just to mix it up a little bit. But yeah, the answer is yes. I like to mix in a little bit of that skill in addition to the sort of the adaptation.
Yeah, I'm a fan of the 1 minute, effort. I personally have people, because you can get so much speed on those efforts, they could be hard to stay on top of the gear, especially on a cross bike. If you're actually doing them on a cross bike, I have them go uphill, and I'll have them do 30 seconds, out of the saddle as hard as they can, and then settle in and finish in the saddle just to kind of like completely fry everything if they're going as hard as they can, and then finish out the effort. Just more or less. Yeah. And picking a place on the horizon, to finish, because you don't want to look at that timer. But I find those hard.
We've been talking a lot about in our own calls and coaching. The Sven Hill has been coming up in our conversations a lot lately, and this is more of a question I think for Al, who I know likes this and assigns a lot to his athletes. When you're doing that kind of high torque, uphill power effort, where you're working on, there's a torque factor, a power factor, and a technique factor, and it's uphill, hard uphill riding. Should we save that for the sprint? How long are those?
So yeah, it's definitely in the sprint domain because it's neuromuscular, and you're trying to break certain mechanisms in the muscle. So where anaerobic work, it tends to be more in that up to 90 seconds, like maybe 20 to 90 seconds. Which I don't use a ton of because that's something that isn't a big limiter for most of my athletes. It's like doing that work is very costly and often comes at the expense of something that's a greater limiter. So starts are good, but anaerobic work is not one of my main focuses, but neuromuscular work, because it relates to fatigue of the muscle, and whether it's like a leaky like calcium channel or something else, it's like it's not really that kind of steady state physiology work on. There's like more of a kind of like a nuanced muscle fiber damage that happens when we see those torques that can really like the power won't really ever show it in your race, but you just kind of lose a lot of your fitness. But that's a fatigue like related thing that's almost more related to resistance training and lifting than our traditional zones on the bike.
I would say it's the workout I probably do and assign the least often, even if I'm in an intensity period where I'm trying to work on efforts over threshold as the period that I have an athlete in. When I have limited training days, it's almost always the one that gets chopped. So if I have a 2-day block they have that I would have liked for them to do, that's anaerobic work capacity on the first day and VO2 max on the second day, but I need an extra recovery day for them. That extra recovery day, like it's the 1 minute interval that gets chopped. I don't take the recovery day and push the 1 minute, the AWC day back. I get rid of that one because it's the one that we need the least. And yeah, it probably is the most damaging.
It's a good peak. I'd say peaking workout. So I'd use that it's like a critical time. You use it for peaking. So like it brings on like the last bit of like fitness, but like it's not your bread and butter workout. So you need somebody to really tell you when to use this like as a elegant tool for eliciting a good peak, but it's not your daily drive.
And so when you're talking about using it for a peak, would you say like in the 10 days before the target event as part of your, after you've rested and part of your opening back up to really sharpen for the event?
I tend to like 45 seconds. Like for some reason, like the last 15 seconds have like really like it kind of really cracks people. But like 45 seconds for me has just been, I think part of it was like personally, that's what worked better for me. But like, that's where you just kind of get into like the nuance of it. But I'd say 45 seconds is my go-to peaking workout.
Agree. And I think we could have a whole call on this because I agree that the last 15 seconds of a 1 minute interval, I go back and forth about, is this where the magic is happening or is this where someone is ruining their form? Because I think people are pedaling with their hands in the last 15 seconds of a 1 minute interval, right? And it's hard to 100%. Know if that is that trade off, is the cost worth the benefit of those last 15 seconds.
100% rider to rider depending, because I have some people that could do 1 minute all day long and like they don't even get tired from them, or someone that can do a 1 minute and can't ride literally can't ride a bike after for a day. So these are like, there's no universal application of like this type of work. And because there's so much variability, that's where coaching becomes critical, because you have to know the cost recovery wise on the individual, because there's no average that will help you here.
Yeah. And you have to the inside testing will help us predict that, but you also just have to observe it with each athlete. And you see that all the time. Like if an athlete is doing a sprint workout the day before a threshold workout, does that sprint workout destroy their threshold work the next day compared to if that threshold work was the first day? That's a similar pattern that I observe for athletes and have to make adjustments based on. Mike, should we let you go there before we jump into sprints? We lost Jacob there, so he's all set. But let's see the baby before you go.
That's right. I have to, full disclosure, I have to take my kid to daycare.
Hey,
there he is. He's been the best boy, not making too much noise all podcast.
He's been great. Well, I'm glad.
Everyone.
Yeah, glad you could join us while you were parenting. Thanks. Just the three of us now, guys.
And there were three.
Yeah, but we did a good job here. We just got sprints left to talk about, and we talk about sprints. Just for the listeners, we're talking about, generally speaking, we're talking about 8 to 15 second maximal efforts. So, however you're doing them, that's the duration of that effort, unpaced, hard as you can. And then there are so many ways to do sprints. Anyway, there's so many ways to do sprints on the road that when we're talking about sprints for cross, it feels like almost infinite. So you can do peak cadence sprints where you don't shift and you're aiming for maximum RPMs as the goal of your sprint. You can do peak torque sprints, where you're, again, not shifting, but you're sprinting in essentially the biggest gear you can pedal. And every pedal stroke is a 1 rep maximum type effort where you're pedaling with maximum torque at a low RPM. You can do what I call peak power sprints, where you still are staying seated for these and you still aren't shifting, but you're picking a gear that you have a lot of torque to overcome early. And so you're hitting peak torque. But then by the end of the interval, you're approaching your peak cadence. So both of those things happen, but where those things overlap is where you're going to achieve your peak power. We have peak, I call them peak speed sprints, where you are finally standing up and shifting down through the gears so that you are getting peak cadence. You're not hitting peak cadence, you're hitting optimal cadence for power production, and then shifting down through the gears, which is a thing that athletes need to practice, and especially need to practice for cyclocross. I'm always surprised when I start coaching an athlete and I discover they don't know how to shift while sprinting. They are not capable of shifting down through the gears while sprinting, and discovering that that's a thing that we need to work on.
And so that's changed.
In those
that's
peaks,
changed a lot in the last 5 years, because we used to race 40 race days a summer, and so we could, like, the utility of a sprint workout has radically changed, I'd say, in the last decade, because it was something where, like, you've done tens of thousands of these over the summer in the past, but now, like, people don't have the technique or the physiology. So I think sprint workouts are having a resurgence, much like rollers.
Interesting. We haven't talked about this. I didn't know that you felt that way. That is an interesting perspective. You're absolutely right. People are racing less often.
Look at what we used to do, and like now I'm seeing people with like 5 race days a summer, and there's no comparison. So that shifts the utility of a sprint workout radically.
Yeah, that is a really great point. And I think that shows up when we talk generally about how skill has gone down. In this era of bike racing, we see an increased amount of fitness and training.
Steady state fitness.
Yeah, trainer work.
Trainer for fitness, yeah, sorry.
That's right. And craft. We are seeing a dearth of craft. And I would consider being able to shift while sprinting absolutely an aspect of craft. And so now when we want to take that and move that over to a cyclocross specific application, hey, look, every single start you do is a peak speed sprint where you are shifting. You should be shifting down through the gears as you accelerate. What I thought you were going to say, Al, the big change was electronic shifting. That's where I thought you were about to go with that. And so that is probably worth mentioning, that the ability to shift down through the gears maybe has changed and gotten easier with electronic shifting. Shifting is more reliable. You press the button and it goes where it's supposed to go. And so I guess to summarize that long intro is one of the basic ways we do sprint training during the cross season is start practice, right? I talked about with the AWC work, doing a practice start that is the whole start, that is 45 seconds to a minute long. But now we're talking about just the first 15 seconds, just basically shifting through the gears. And when you get to the last gear that you can pedal, that usually is somewhere close to 12 seconds or so. And then you sit down. That's the end of the sprint. I assume you're all using it that way as well.
Yeah, I use those. I use the low cadence ones. I mean, it's like you were saying, there's so many different variables on what you're actually doing when you're sprinting. It's sort of like a mountain bike. I mean, you're putting out as much wattage as you can at 60 RPMs. And then there's sometimes where you're absolutely grinding up a hill sprinting when it's muddy and you're putting out, whatever, so you have to have that mechanism tuned in.
And then I think when I think of that, what are the other ways that we have to make those maximal efforts during cyclocross? And this is where I think skill, when we started by talking about how we shouldn't do skills training on a recovery day. And the opposite end of that is sprint days are a great day to do skills work because you can incorporate those explosive movements into that technique. So early in the season, I really like run up practice on the sprint day, where instead of maybe just doing starts, or maybe you split it with half of your sprints are starts, half of them are run-ups. So do you have a hill that's steep enough that you can ride into, dismount, put the bike on your shoulder, and sprint for 10 seconds, get to the top, remount, and continue that sprint effort by then accelerating? Because you want to program. Here's where I think there's a bit of mental training. You can't just do the sprint and remount and soft pedal away. You have to program remounting and re-accelerating. So when I do run-up sprints, I don't just want the run up the hill to be the sprint. I want a re-acceleration after the remount. I realize that introduces a pause in the effort, but the pause in the effort is what? The pause in the effort is you remounting your bicycle, which is another explosive movement. So it's still 15 seconds of 3 different types of explosive movements that you need for cyclocross. So I really like that too.
Yeah, I built a course that has that exact start into a ride up, run up with like the re-acceleration, and like the sprint isn't done until you're going down the hill.
Yeah. This is a great place when we're talking about tracks and designing tracks, to design a loop that allows you to come back around to that spot, like where you can ride out and recover and then come back to that spot and do it again.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about I'd like to find another, we keep calling it the Sven Hill, and I want to find, we shouldn't give Sven all the credit, right? Like, we've been sprinting up hills forever, but it's just because of where we pulled it, we've started it, the shorthand we use for it is the Sven Hill. But do you want to talk about that more, Al, now that we're talking about sprints, like how you're utilizing that, and like what kind of hill are you using, and what's the technique? If we understand the physiology benefit, what's the technique benefit that we're trying to get? And maybe we don't. Maybe you want to explain the physiology benefit again as well.
Well, I think the technique is really helpful because you want the hill to be barely rideable that you have to manage traction on. And that's kind of where you learn to like how to pedal hard but not spin your rear wheel, but also to keep your front wheel on the ground. And like you have to be pedaling as hard as you can, maintain traction, but still keep your head up in drive. So if I can mix all of those things, the kind of the high torque, essentially it should feel like you're doing single leg squats, managing traction and driving. Yeah. That is my perfect sprint for these.
Yeah. That's great.
And the funny thing with this, like usually the harder, like people often will go to easier gear. So as I get them to shift down into slightly harder gears, they're more likely to clear it. So then it also informs the process on hard sections. If you go harder versus like trying to spin up it, you often clear it better and get back to recovering sooner. But can like take something that might, if you go the easy gear, it might take you 10 seconds, but you might be able to knock it down to like 5 or 6 if you go really hard and clear it. So these spots have the most room for lowering your lap time if you hit them harder, even if you have to pedal a little bit easier going in. So you concede like 1, but then pick up 3 or 4 seconds.
Yeah, like the micro rest on the entrance followed by the truly explosive effort. Well, the micro rest allows you to make the explosive effort.
And knowing what effort knocks out your high torque capacity, and like making sure like it teaches people to conserve that high torque capacity for the duration of the race, because that's what really keeps you going fast. When you lose that part of your physiology, then you're just riding around slowly in a time trial.
You're crawling in. Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so practicing those helps teach you that right combo of effort and torque to get the traction and technique to clear something quickly. Because you're not, as we said earlier, you're not trying to just steady state the whole way around. You have to be explosive in a spot like this. And you don't just sometimes have to recover after, but you have to rest before to charge the turbo, so to speak. I sometimes use a video game analogy of charging your special weapon so that you can then unleash it on the short, steep hill and be explosive there and clear it on the other side. It's a great point. I think that we've gone through all the zones, and I think the thing I want to finish off is just to talk about running as its own separate thing for a second, and how to incorporate running and what zones you incorporate it in. So I know for me, the way I evaluate it is often by where riders live and the kind of races that they're doing. And for most US racers, maybe with the exception of folks in the Northwest, the running that we're doing is for barriers and for short run-ups. We generally are not doing tractor pull, Euro style. Half the time on the course is running at threshold. Our running is almost all short sprint type efforts. And so the running I
until you
often
get
want
to
people to.
nationals.
It's a good point because I just said this to an athlete yesterday. We do a lot more running in November because we anticipate weather in December and a harder course at nationals that will often require an amount of running that we didn't have to do all season long. So I'm glad you mentioned it because I literally said that to an athlete yesterday. Early in the season, I'm mostly having athletes do a 15-minute adaptation run. They're not running for fitness. I'm not having them run because I want their aerobic engine to improve as a result of the running they're doing. I want them to be able to run enough so that when they're running in the races, they can run efficiently without injury and without needing recovery time from the act of running in the races. So that can come from 15-minute adaptation runs once a week, twice a week. Later in the season, maybe every training day can include a 15-minute jog. And then the other running is just happening in the races. When they're doing their threshold work on a track, make sure that there's a run included on that track if you can. And that can often be enough running. I think doing reverse lunges as part of your core work can be as beneficial to your running as actually running itself. Where are you all using running? You have anything to add to that?
I use running a decent amount. I've been having, you know, my athletes work on leg speed. It seems that a lot of them have, when they get the bike on their shoulder, they turn into more like it's tiny steps, kind of thing. And so actually running fluidly with the bike. But I think, when we do adaptation runs, I do like to start out with that. And then I like to bring in some more interval runs, whether it's like stairs or concentrating on like, cadence drills with leg speed and stuff like that, just to be able to like make it an asset to them rather than like a survival point.
So it's still
So
technique oriented, what you're talking about, rather than engine building. It's infrastructure building. Sometimes
yeah, there's some
context opening.
specificity
Yeah.
built in there, and none of them go over 45 minutes. Like I think a half an hour is what I usually max out at.
Yeah.
But
Pace
none of
is
them,
critical on
I'd
running.
say,
Like we have to keep running slow because I don't think we're ever really trying
yeah,
to build our engine with this. I really like having running in
Agree.
our
yeah,
back
Strongly
pocket, like
agree.
for busy days. Like if your day goes sideways, you can hop out for 30 minutes of running, and it might take you 35 minutes for the whole workout. So busy people should have
And you're
running
not hurting
accessible.
yourself doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah. You should be
no,
able to go out and do that and not have it negatively impact you for days after. So
Right.
you
And
want to be
that's where
adapted to the running. Yeah.
pace really comes in. Like where we shouldn't ever be running at reasonable splits. Like they should be pretty slow and kind of like not painfully slow, but like easier than you really think it should be. Like you're not suffering during your run. It's somewhat
Yeah.
enjoyable.
Jogging. I'll use the
Yeah.
word jogging.
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah. I'll
Well, I'm
say
saying
jogging.
like 9 to 10 minutes, something pretty chill. And I like to also like make sure my people, depending on like if you've had injuries, if you have metal in your body, things like that, like the shoes are critical too. Being able to make sure that no one's going out and doing 3 miles on the city
Right.
streets,
Trail is
yeah,
nice to get on.
Yeah, it's fun.
yeah,
And then, so when we're getting later in the season, we're getting closer to nationals where we all agree we need to increase the amount of running that we're doing because we expect to have to do those extended runs. Or if you have an athlete that's going to Europe where they may have to do extended runs, are you increasing the length of the running sessions or just the frequency of those sessions or both?
I usually max out at that
for
kind of
me,
the
oh,
adaptation like 20 to 30 minutes. That stays on like a Tuesday, and then we increase the amount of time on their Wednesday session. Like build into your course a much longer run because I think the run is as much about like can you pedal after running in the remount? And so like the standalone run has very little utility for me. It just kind of gets you ready to actually
past adaptation.
Right.
Yeah.
It just kind of gets you ready to actually train for running for cross.
So just adding more running to the cross work that you're doing makes perfect sense. You're
Right,
keeping it in context.
The specificity is running in your cycling shoes, because that's like there's so little crossover to running and running shoes versus like how you like strike with a cycling shoe, and then kind of getting back on whether you're like at your pace you run.
And let me ask you this: would you ever? Oh, sorry, Al, we lost you for a second there.
I think you were going to say, would you ever run in your cycling shoes?
No,
Adam.
No, you're close though. You're close though. So when we get those tractor pull races where you're running in deep mud, there's a lot of torque involved in that type of run. You're pulling your foot out of the mud, and you have a heavy foot that you're putting down as your next step.
Run in sand.
I have not ever done. Yeah, well, what about running with ankle weights?
No.
Exactly. I've never done it either, but I want to ask because it comes
absolutely
up,
not.
and so I want
to.
Because it doesn't actually resemble what we're doing.
I used to skate, hockey with ankle weights sometimes, and it would always throw off like my equilibrium. It would just make me feel weird. What I was going to say about the running.
Well, hold that thought. So just I want to put a. So Al said running in sand is the way you address that.
100%. Yeah, there's no question here. That's the correct answer.
Yeah,
run in sand.
Great, thank you. I was a little bit of a setup because I was fishing for an answer. So thank you.
Okay, Suzanne Summers. It's gonna be some kind of like exercise infomercial.
Yeah,
that's it. Running in sand. I do like the drills. If we're doing drills with like, the cyclocross family up here, the ride run drills where you have a whistle and you're going and you determine when the run starts and then when the run ends.
If you don't have like a way to do that in your track, you can program it, essentially, is what you're saying.
Because with ours, it seems like you can have specific times to run. But then there's other times, like if it's prolonged and, like you just run the entire wooded section, if that's like what is determined, it helps out to have that or have it in your brain, like, when you're going to do it.
And the way you add that to a workout doesn't have to be a run up. You could artificially say, hey, today we're going to run, even though it's flat, or maybe especially because it's flat, this little section of our track here that is rideable, we're going to all agree to get off and run for this 10-second bit or 20-second bit on the flat of this track.
I think the idea is like you get kicked off your bike. It's not, like it's usually the rider in front of you, the situation, you get kicked off. So having someone randomly, like I'll be in the back with a whistle, and we'll be going. And then, when it hits, everybody's off, and you blow it and they're back on. And it adds randomness, like that you're not having everybody run the pavement, but it does bring that lottery into it of like, when am I going to need to run?
Yeah. Good. All right, let's pull up there. I think that's great. That is even more material than I thought we would have to talk about. So I'm real happy with everything that we touched on here. It's a great place to wrap it up.
You want to talk tires or?
No. We have another 90 minutes. Yeah, thanks guys. And thanks to the other coaches who had to duck out early. Glad we got them for the time that we did. Sometimes it's, we've all got our athletes to attend to as well. So we're getting this podcast done in between conversations we're also trying to have with our athletes. So, or in Mike's case, got to get the kid to daycare. So thanks for tuning in, everyone. And if you have questions, you can either email us at coaching@cyclesmart.com if you have a follow-up question. If you're watching this on YouTube, feel free to leave some questions in the comments and we'll get back to them. If you liked what you heard and it was revelatory for you in any way, remember that all of the CycleSmart coaches, except for me, are accepting new athletes. And we would love to be able to help you with this in a specific way. I would say we didn't give everything away, today. We certainly are keeping some of our special sauce back just for the athletes. And so, yeah, if you want access to everything that we can tell you about this, yeah, we'd love to help you with that. So coaching at cycle-smart.com is the place to reach out if you're interested in more. Otherwise, thanks everyone.